You know, one of my favorite discussions post CDL Dallas was the instant reaction that everybody had in the community was, well, what's the top four now? Right? Did Florida just eclipse the top four teams in the CDL with that win over the Rocker? Right? Did they prove enough this event to be put in that conversation? So let's go through it. Right? I've looked at this for days now. Right? I've got my current top four teams in the CDL. So let's go and run through it. Right? And for those who may be watching us right now, feel free, put in the chat, let us know on Twitter, tweet at myself at Lando, use the hashtag off the break. Top four teams, who do you have right now? So I'm going to go in order of mine. And starting off at number one, I've got the Atlanta FaZe, right? To really no one's surprise, this team, especially after not being at Dallas, it actually kind of helped them a little bit, right? A lot of surprises, a lot of shocks for teams. This result, however, by not being there, kind of helped them. And in retrospect, it kind of helped them a little bit by not having to worry about all the major crazy defeats that we saw. Definitely hasn't really moved for me, this team. They look like the best team in the world still. They lose an incredibly close series to the only team that's caused them problems this year in the last event that they played at. Their only loss this season to the Minnesota Rocker. Again, we don't see them in Dallas, but going off what we know about this team, they should still be excellent. Right, they don't move away from my number one list. And kind of for me, the main worry, or rather the main phrase that I've said throughout this year, innocent until proven otherwise. Innocent until proven guilty. I don't have a reason to say that FaZe is guilty, right? To lower them to 2 or to lower them to 3. I don't have a reason for that. There's no reason to say that this team isn't as good as they've previously been because there is no information saying otherwise. They lose to the Minnesota Rocker, but that's the only team that's caused them problems throughout the year. Again, not in Dallas. Again, really haven't lost a series outside of the one versus Minnesota Rocker that they probably shouldn't have won, right? That's the only loss they have this season. You got to keep Atlanta FaZe in the number one spot. I don't care who you are. Atlanta, still the number one team in the world. Number two, I have the Chicago Huntsmen. Chicago Huntsmen, I've seen a few people start to move this team down the list a little bit. And I know I've been someone who's been very critical of Chicago, which I'll get into. Reason being is that they are held to a higher standard with the team that they have, right? You have a group of these players on paper. You have to hold them to a standard that is higher than many other rosters. So you have to critique the little things. The same thing goes for Atlanta FaZe. There just hasn't really been a whole lot to critique. The team that they've struggled against is the roster that coming in to Dallas was a top 4 team. Right, we'll get into where we have them right now, but the only loss that they've suffered is to a team that's pretty good. Chicago, really for them, they're held to a higher standard because they are in that elite level. At least for me, they used to be. Right? They didn't look solid in Atlanta when they go game 5, round 11 versus Toronto, a Toronto roster that did not look like the same team that we saw here in Dallas. A different roster, a team that did not look all that promising. Yet Chicago goes to a game 5, round 11. When they lose at the time by the worst score in CDL hardpoint history to the Rocker in game 1. Also, another kind of unfortunate situation. However, they do walk away with the rest of that in a 3-1 manner. Still, right? Have an unfortunate game 1 loss. We'll wipe that away. But they move on to the next series when they later get reverse swept by a hot Mutineers roster. Not a solid event in ATL, right? Not a solid event in Atlanta. Game 5, round 11 versus Toronto, right? You lose a very, very bad hardpoint versus the Minnesota Rocker, and then you move forward and you get reverse swept by the Mutineers, of which all 5 games were close. It very well could have been a 4-0 or a 5-0 for Florida. They were looking that good on that day. And I'll tell you what, LA didn't really make me feel all that much better about Chicago either. But they get the 3-0 versus Minnesota. Granted, every map was extremely close, but I'll give them that. Right, a 10-point hardpoint victory, a round 11 search and destroy, a 7-point domination win. They have a semi-close 3-1 victory over the Paris Legion, and they later get dropped in the rematch to Florida. The problem I had with Chicago is that they haven't really looked dominant really versus anybody in Atlanta or versus anybody in Dallas. I went back and I kind of counted up how many maps that they have played in both Atlanta and Dallas. Those maps, all of those equal out to 25. They played 25 maps total from Atlanta and Dallas collectively. In those in particular, just counting Hardpoint, they've gone 6-4. Out of the 10 Hardpoints they've played, only twice has the opponent not reached 200 points. And those other scores are 189 and 199. So you can pretty much say that 9 out of the 10 Hardpoints, the enemy has at least reached a score of 200. When they lose S&D, they've lost dominantly. 6 2s, 6 1s. When they've won 4 to 5 times, they're going to a round 10 or a round 11 in Search and Destroy. The only dominant wins they've had were a domination versus Toronto in Atlanta and a domination victory versus Paris in LA. Out of 25 maps, that's it. That's realistically it. You look at the Hardpoint victories, nothing really dominant. I mean, 250 to 189, 250 to 199, that's not dominant. That's a solid win, but it's not a dominant victory. The issues that I have for the Huntsmen is that they're winning close games and they're losing in dominant ways. Well, the Huntsmen sit in second of my power rankings. I'll be honest, it's kind of starting to teeter a little bit. It's starting to make me a little bit worried about this team because we really haven't seen the same roster that we saw in London. It hasn't been that same roster. But a major reason why they haven't shifted as much is because of who I have in third. And because of the way that they looked, and rather because of the way that this team looked in Dallas as well. That being Dallas's own, the Empire, right? The reason why I don't have Chicago really fluctuating all that much is because the team that would probably pass them is a team that didn't really do much better, if better at all. Right? The Dallas Empire, third place for me in my current standings right now of what I believe Benson has kind of called the Power Four, which I think is a great kind of name for it. Very accurate. I guess now you can kind of say Power Five, depending on how many, teams that are kind of up there right now. But in terms of my Power Four, as we'll label it, my current third team, the Dallas Empire. This roster, if they looked better in Dallas, would be in consideration to move upwards, right? If they win this event, if they win their own homestand, they're moving above Chicago in my eyes. But they didn't have an amazing home series themselves, right? Let's go over their kind of run, if you will. They have a tight series versus LAG, right? That one should have gone to a game 5. If it wasn't for a massive clutch that comes through from Illy in the Hackney Yard Hardpoint, an insane comeback that they have. It was around, I think, maybe a 70, 80 point comeback, something like that. Regardless, they win it in a huge clutch that comes in from Illy. They hold P5. They win the rest of the series. They go game 5. I'm honestly a little bit worried about the Empire at that point. Their series later on versus Toronto goes to a game 5 in which they lose the game 3 Dom and the game 4 Hardpoint. They have a somewhat closer series versus Minnesota. But they only managed to take the Search and Destroy, right? None of the respawns looked especially fantastic. Nobody looked like they were really on their A game. It was pretty much all highlighting Minnesota, as Minnesota finally got a big victory versus somebody that wasn't Atlanta. And that is kind of what carried on this team to obviously make it to a finals in which they looked like the ultimate front runner. This team in Dallas didn't look really well polished, right? When it came down to respawns, they finished 3-3 in Hardpoint. They finished 1-2 in Domination. And they can't have that record considering the only top team that they faced off against in Dallas was the Rocker. But it was one event. I understand online was a problem for a lot of teams. And in the interview I did with Rambo, who, for those who don't know, obviously COD father, right? A big veteran in the Call of Duty scene, current coach for the Dallas Empire. When I talked to Rambo in an interview I had with him, he said that they really struggled with the internet. They really struggle with a lot of these dedicated servers. And that is something that I mentioned last episode. Keep that in mind. right? As much as I want to talk about results, we all realize online is a factor. I get it. But in general, we have to take the information that we've got. We have to take what we have for right now. And when I talked to Rambo, the biggest thing he talked about was the servers that they were playing on, the teams that they were facing off against, the internet problems that they suffered. I get it. And I'm by no means giving them a pass. Keep that in mind. I'm not giving Dallas a pass for this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not giving them a pass on their performance when it came down to their own homestand. But I've said this since pretty much the start of the season. I give you two events, right? One event, okay, everyone has their off series, right? Everyone has an off day. Everyone has an off weekend. I give you an event to be bad, but if it becomes a trend, that's when we start to raise the questions. So I'll give Dallas this weekend. But if we see it happen in Chicago, which is going to be a very difficult weekend for all of the top teams, that is when we'll start to really address it. Like I'm giving them this weekend a little bit. I'm a little bit kind when it comes down to it, but in general, not a great weekend from them. I thought they really had the potential to move upwards after what we saw from Chicago, but they didn't really put up all that much of an impressive result, considering the fact that they beat Toronto, they beat LAG, and that's really it. That's actually it. And both of those series were close. They lose to a Minnesota Rocker team, who obviously is a top caliber roster, but still, yet it's not easy to move this team up, and I can't move this team up. They can't move past third right now. But I will say I did like what I saw from Illy and Shotzi. I did. I thought that they played very, very well. Obviously, the slang in general just wasn't all that consistent from the other three, especially Krim and Clay. Had an event that I'm sure they'll like to forget. Let's just go and put it that way. But finally, right? Finally, the number 4 spot. This, for me, is between two teams. That being the Florida Mutineers and the Minnesota Rocker. But who gets this spot, right? Let's go ahead and proceed to compare the two. Right, the big conversation point is, hey, where does Florida rank? Does Minnesota get placed out of there? Does Dallas get placed out of there? Does Chicago get placed out of there? If you say FaZe, you're crazy. But otherwise, the other three, there's a conversation to be had there. But for me, it comes down to the Rocker right now. So let's go ahead and proceed to compare the two right now. Florida Mutineers, second in Atlanta, top 6 in LA, where they did have a new team, first in Dallas. They've beaten Chicago twice. They've beaten Minnesota. They've been in 2 grand finals, and now they have a title. Minnesota Rocker, top 4 in Atlanta, top 2 in LA, and top 2 in Dallas. They have beaten Atlanta. They're currently the only team to have done that. They've beaten Dallas, and now they as well have been in 2 grand finals. So who do you put there? I mean, really, 2 teams that make an excellent case for deserving a right to be in that conversation of a top 4 team in the world. 2 things decide this for me. 2 things decide who I have as my current 4th best team in the world. Those 2 factors, and I'm going to go ahead and say who I have right now. The 2 things that factor in are the way that Florida beat Minnesota in the Dallas home series final, and the fact that Florida now has a championship. We cannot under-highlight the amount of hype that the Minnesota Rocker had coming into that final. I put out tweets. The CDL was putting out tweets. The predictions were made from everybody. And 9 out of 10 people thought, this is Rockers. I even tweeted it out. I said, this is going to be the Minnesota Rockers' opportunity to finally claim a championship. When we left LAN, right? When we left the LAN environment in LA, it was Rocker going down. It was Rocker barely losing to the Dallas Empire. And so when it came down to the online environment, it was, this is this team's chance. And to be honest with you, they kind of exceeded my expectations. Obviously, people had Dallas and Chicago in the grand finals, but I was worried about the Rocker. I had a chance to sit down with Gutter X. I talked with him a little bit. He said, you know what, online, we're focused, we're ready to go, but it can be frustrating, right? I think Gutter X is in Maryland, Silly is in Las Vegas, Asim is in Canada, Obviously, there's a lot of teams that are now kind of dealing with that. I think Illy officially is back in Canada now as well, but still, yet internet there can be problems there. There's not a whole lot of consistency with this team in terms of connection. Not talking about playing, but in terms of connection. So that was kind of my worry for this team coming into the event was, how are they going to play? How is the online environment going to treat this team? They were a team that was constantly brought up along with the Atlanta FaZe and along with the Dallas Empire, especially the Dallas Empire, on how would this team translate to an online environment? Because this team clearly is better on LAN, and that's what GodRx told me. He said, we're going to be a much better team on LAN. Let's see how we do when it comes down to online, considering the issues that not just they are facing, but that the world is facing. So the way that Florida beat Minnesota in the Dallas home series final told me, all right, this is something to consider. This is a team that made the claim. This is a roster that looks fantastic. This is a team that's starting to hit their stride. And the most important thing about this is that while this was the best that we have seen from Florida, and I think this will probably be the best result that we see from them all year long, but it's important to think about the consistency of this team, because have we seen the best from some of their other players? Havoc looked fantastic this weekend, right? Route Man gets paid. He was playing his role. He was playing the way that SMGs are supposed to play in this game, which is to think about future spawns, which is to be kind of that blitz-minded player. If we're going back to Call of Duty Ghosts, he was playing that role. We saw someone step up alongside Mox, or rather, alongside what has been kind of the most consistent player for Florida in Skies. We saw Pharaoh be that guy. And speaking of Mox, we saw him play much better. We saw a team effort from Florida, and they finally had the second Slayer that they have been waiting on. They finally got that guy who stepped up and was one top player that wasn't an AR. Obviously, Frosty was there. And that's the big thing for me, too, is how great is Frosty going to be for the future? The big thing, the biggest story coming into the year when Florida was the original roster was, okay, let's look at this group, some inconsistent players. But if Frosty can be that guy, if Mox can be that guy, if Skies can be that guy, this is going to be a great team. And so far, they've been a good team. Granted, Mox hasn't had the greatest year, and I cater that a lot to the map. I cater that a lot to the maps and the way that this game plays with the meta, right? Flex is by no means highlighted, rated for London Royal Ravens, 0 for the subliners. No, not a whole lot of flexes are getting a lot of love right now. Obviously, there are some, like Celium and GodRx, and depending on what the Huntsmen do for the future, Arstees has looked great in that role. There's a few others still, but nonetheless, the way that Florida beat Minnesota and Dallas was so impressive to me because the Rocker looked like they had the ultimate advantage. Florida looked good, right? Obviously, Florida, they take down the Chicago Huntsmen, but nonetheless, the way that Minnesota was firing and the big conversation, if you talk to any pro player, the biggest thing coming into that grand final is the momentum that the team who just won now has. And that was the biggest thing for me with the Minnesota Rocker, right? If we're talking about the big thing that previously used to exist was the matter of teams getting burned out, right? That was the big storyline. Okay, this team coming in, they played a lot of matches today. They've kind of fired their way through the losers bracket. If this team comes through and they win, the first series 3-0, they're good for the next one. But the problem is if they visit multiple game fives, because that's when they can start to really hurt. That doesn't happen anymore with the format. Right? That doesn't happen anymore now with what we have. The thing with Florida was that they had waited a little bit, right? They beat the Huntsmen, great. But the Rocker had just come from beating a team that has caused them so many problems this year in Dallas. They finally take down this team, and now they look like the hot roster coming into this grand final. Everybody was talking about it. Like I said, I tweeted it. Every person thought that Minnesota was walking away with this, and I'm pretty sure that they thought it themselves. I'm pretty sure that they thought, finally, we're getting into a grand final where we don't have to deal with Dallas, where we don't have to deal with Chicago, where we don't have to deal with FaZe. Granted, it looked good versus FaZe, but nonetheless, they didn't have one of those final bosses staring them in the face. It's kind of funny considering the coach of the Florida Mutineers, but you get my point. The way that Florida beat not just Minnesota, but beat arguably the hottest Minnesota Rocker team, the hottest form that they have been in so far this season, The fact that they take them down for me is what gives them the edge. The second thing that gives them the edge, considering the way that Minnesota was playing, considering the fact that Assault was having fantastic moments, Alex was looking better, considering connection, Silly was looking like Mr. Consistent, even though Alex wasn't having the greatest event. Considering those things, the other is that Florida has a championship, right? They're 1-for-1. They lose to Atlanta, understandably so. But they have a championship now, and that counts for something. Granted, keep in mind, the only major kind of loss, which we've only had a few events, the only major loss that Florida has had this year is whenever they got top 6 in LA. And that was off of a very recent roster change. I thought for me that roster change meant more, but here in Dallas, it proved that that really was maybe more of an outlier. I thought it would be more of a consistent thing, but they kind of proved that it would be more of an outlier. Outside of what was a last-second roster change, which Prestini does not play for them in LA, they get one scrimmage. Coming into LA, they finish top 6. Not great, right? But outside of that, it's second in Atlanta and first in Dallas. Back-to-back grand final appearances, which it's hard to counter that with the Minnesota Rocker because they have a top 4 and 2 grand final appearances. But the big thing for me that eclipses all of that is the fact that Florida now has a championship, right? For me, all of my top 4 teams have a championship. Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago, and now Florida. That's the way that I look at it. And it could change, and it really wouldn't surprise me if Florida and Minnesota start to fluctuate, right? We're kind of in the conversation of where's Chicago at right now. The same conversation with where's Dallas at right now. It wouldn't surprise me if this fluctuates. I'll be honest, it would kind of surprise me if we see Florida raise higher than 4th, at least on my personal list, depending on where you have them. Like I said, feel free to let us know on social media. Hashtag off the break. Where do you have Florida right now in your top 4? But I had them in 4th. And it's hard for me to put them there. It really is, because I have tried to really go against the grain a little bit and saying, you know what? It's probably just one event they're going to be able to do this. And, we covered it. We covered it last episode. Can Florida be a contender for the future? It's going to be hard because they're constantly going to run up against difficult brackets. I think the one major chance that they're going to have is going to be in line. If you look at the teams they're going to face off there, a real chance at that event. But outside of it, they've got Atlanta phased in pretty much every single bracket. If they don't, they have a major stacked group in a lot of the events that they're going to have. They can make it out of group stages, but right now Atlanta phase, they just look so good, which we'll have to see what kind of occurs with that. But for me, like I said, Minnesota right there in 5th, and it is probably a 4.5 rather than a 5th placement for the Rocker right now. I like the way that Chicago has looked. I like the way that they've played. Or did I say Chicago? I'm going to say I like the way that Florida have played recently, but we need to see a little bit more. I'm excited to see what continues to take place. I'll at least put it that way. I'm excited to see what continues to take place for both of these squads in particular, to see what can occur, to see how both these rosters begin to shape up.